Welcome to the Foster. I'm Anne Baxter, and I'm sitting in front of a very large and wonderful artwork by Tony Foster called Ilulissat from 400 feet above our camp at Kangia, looking 220 degrees true southwest across the Kangia. That's quite a title. And it's quite a large artwork as well. It measures approximately 3.5 feet tall by 6 feet wide. And joining us via Zoom is Tony Foster, currently at home in Cornwall, England. Are you in your studio, Tony?
I am, yes. It's one of my favorite place in the house.
What is behind you? I think people will be curious about what you have on your wall there.
Well, as people who know my work will realize, I do include what I call souvenirs in my paintings, as sort of proof that I've actually been there. And of course, I have to have those carefully filed in polythene bags when I get home. And so the background there is all of my souvenirs filed from my first paintings, I guess, in about 1982, all the way through to 2021. So it's basically one man's entire career pinned up on the wall in polythene bags.
Very well documented, I know. So let's just jump ahead to the water. This artwork has not only the watercolor, but it has souvenirs of details that you've painted, of objects you found, but it also has a little glass bottle labeled of melted iceberg, right? And how did you bring that home, and how do you save that?
Well, of course, it wasn't frozen when I brought it home. It was already liquid. And in fact, if you behind my left shoulder, you can see a row of little bottles there, and one of those actually says Equi, which is one of the icebergs up at in one part of Greenland where we worked, and another says Ilulissat. And so they're all probably labeled. Yeah, they're all there.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, they're all well capped, so you aren't going to lose any of that.
No, that's right. They're all still there. Yeah.
And how do you name your pieces? This is such a long name, but you usually, well, often I'll say, start out with your inscription with exactly where you are. And why is that important to you? And why is that the title of the piece?
Well, I guess, I suppose it's the same instinct really that makes me put maps in with the work. I feel it's important to be exact about where I was when I was there and the facts of doing the work really. And so these places aren't just dreamt up out of my head. They're carefully looked for and very, very precisely documented in many ways. They are works of art. They're not works of topography, but nonetheless, the exactitude about the experience is what matters. And so and I also think that if anybody else wanted to actually track down that exact spot, they would find that my painting was pretty straightforward, really, of what they would see.
Yes.
And so I guess that sort of precision in terms of the precision of the painting is not so important in that, I don't have every leaf and tree and twig that you can see, but I certainly want people to be able to understand how the landscape works exactly, and that's why it's important. I suppose it's because I've traveled with scientists a lot. They've sort of that's rubbed off on me, I think.
Could you describe this particular location where the painting was made and what about it made it a successful site for this large artwork?
Well, I suppose I knew what I wanted in that, of course, the difficulty of painting icebergs is that they move all the time. And what I was after was paintings of icebergs. And so I spoke to some people in the Royal Geographical Societies and friends, and who knew the Arctic very well. And they said, well, what you need to do is to go to Ilulissat and down onto the Kangia, which is a great big ice field. The ice cap is shedding bergs at one end of the field, and they float down the field, not fast, but they do move all the time, really. But when they get to where I was camped, basically, there is an undersea ridge which catches the icebergs, and they catch on this undersea ridge, and they stay there until they finally ground off enough of the rock or ice has been ground off them, so they can then float off and make a big loop, first of all north and then south, until they finally melt. and so that seemed to my colleagues to be, or my friends in the RGS, it seemed to be the most sensible place I could go to, where the icebergs would at least stay in one place for a little while, and
Yes.
long enough for me to paint them.
Yeah. And then there'd be so many, so you're capturing the beauty of the whole space, I guess.
Yes, yes.
Beautiful. So then to decide to paint at this site, you did small sketches first or small watercolors and figure out the right angle, or how did you decide
No,
to
I
sit
just,
right
I
there?
just, in fact, I started work on a 4-foot painting, which I did first. I think it was 4 feet, and then I did this 6-foot one, because I felt that actually the 4-foot one was pretty nice. I was pretty pleased with it, but then I thought actually this demanded a much bigger work really, and so I did this second one, which is 6 feet.
Oh, beautiful.
But it's pretty much similar. If you were to compare the two, you would see that the icebergs have changed a little, but one of them I noticed has sort of floated off into the distance, but most of them you could almost recognize the same one as moving.
This artwork is unique in that it is part of your earlier watermarks journey and also exploring beauty, which is here. It's part of this work. Now, how did that come to be where it's in both journeys?
Well, I suppose it was triggered actually by our next door neighbor, who was an old lady. After I'd done that painting, I saw her in the street, and I said to her, "Hey, Joy, come and see what I've been doing." So I took her up into my studio, and she stood in front of the painting and burst into tears. And I said, "Are you okay?" And she said, "Yeah, I just can't believe there's anywhere in our world that's so beautiful." And she said, "I know I'm only a silly old woman, but I just can't believe that there's anywhere as beautiful as this in our world." And I thought, wow, that's really struck a chord. And so when I was thinking about doing a show about beauty, obviously I felt that I had to include this. And luckily at that time, I also met Carrie Herbert, who was an Arctic fanatic, having lived there for a while herself as a very young child, and had many Inuit friends, and went back there quite regularly. Strangely enough, married to her husband, Hugh Lewis Jones, who's an Antarctic expert. So they couldn't be better suited.
Cover the poles, yes.
They don't trespass on each other's territory, but they both understand what they're up to. And so I'd met Carrie, and I thought that she would be a person who would understand perfectly this painting. And so I simply put the two together, really, and felt I could incorporate it into the exhibition.
Some of her beautiful writings are in your catalog: Exploring Beauty, Watercolor Diaries from the Wild. And I wanted to just quote a couple parts. She wrote about the vulnerability of the polar landscape and the magic in the polar desert. And that's an interesting concept that's true, and how the Arctic has a profound effect on anyone who travels there. So that's why she was the luminary who said, you have to go to the Arctic to paint this for your exhibition. And do you agree with that statement? And if so, what effect has your time in the Arctic had on you?
Yeah, well, I'm fairly used to being in remote places, so it's not that would be my first experience of that side of it. But I suppose, it is completely harsh. It makes no concessions to people's weakness. And so for people to live there, through the long polar night, and in what most of us would think of as excruciating conditions, and yet be generally happy, well-balanced, cheerful people, is just quite extraordinary, I think. And although at first, I wouldn't say people were hostile, but they weren't friendly at first when we first arrived. They were just aloof, I would say. They wouldn't return your greeting or even look in your direction, really, or look in my direction. But then once I started painting, they, of course, were curious about what I was doing, and would come up and look at me and look at my work, and then they start to gesture towards the icebergs to point out they understood that what I was doing in front of me was, in fact, that iceberg over there, and this was that one over there. And then they started to indicate, where these icebergs were moving, where they would go to, and so we built up a conversation, and that was quite. I did feel that then I was making some sort of inroads. But then what happened was a bunch of school children. There was a little school, and a lot of little kids came with their teacher to the top of the hill where I was painting, and they lit a fire and started boiling water in a big black pot, and the kids started collecting bits of vegetation to make Inuit tea, and so they were boiling up this concoction of Inuit tea. And when they got it boiled sufficiently, because they kept coming to me and looking at me and looking over my shoulder and bringing me little presents, little feathers, and it was nice. I mean, the sort of souvenirs I picked for myself, they were picking them and bringing them to me, although they didn't know anything about my work, but they just naturally wanted to give me something. And then when the water was boiled and their teacher said, shouted to them to come back up to drink their tea, they grabbed me by the hand and said, Tony, come, and they dragged me to the top of the hill, and we all had tea together. And after that, whenever I was in the village, the kids would come up and grab my hand and say, hey, Tony, and their parents then got to know me, and it became a much better atmosphere then.
Yes.
Simply by being a painter and the kids getting to know who I was and me having tea with them, I suppose.
One thing I love about this artwork is the souvenirs and the painting of all the details of objects, special objects that are tied with earlier peoples that you can tell a little story about. But I find that very touching, and also it relates so well to Carrie's tie with the Arctic, and then what you just described with the school kids and all. So it's all, not only the land, but the people who live there is an important part of this artwork. So do you want to tell a little bit about how you found, how you painted those pieces?
Yeah, well, what happened was that when I was painting the icebergs there, the biggest iceberg, which is on the right-hand side of the picture, suddenly just turned over, and it was the most extraordinary thing, because it's, if you can imagine, I'm not sure how big it was, because it's very difficult to judge these things, but of course you only see a small portion of the iceberg above waterline. Most of it is below the water, and so not quite sure what induced it to turn over, but a big piece fell off it, and I guess that unbalanced it, and it then turned over, and it created an enormous tidal wave which came up the shore just below where we were camping. Luckily, we camped up the hill a bit, so otherwise it would have swept us away. And then there's the most tremendous crash and noise, and suddenly, ice falling off in every direction and the thing turning over. And anyway, when it had all subsided, we went down to have a look at, see what had happened on the shoreline, and we found the remains of what must have been an Inuit settlement, with all these little pieces, and it went from little stone age or stone arrowheads and stone points all the way through to little bits of rusted points and rusted knife blade and so on. There were also some wonderful glass beads, little tiny glass beads. They do a lot of beadwork, the Inuit, and so we found quite a few of those. But we also found some hand-carved beads, one hand-carved crystal bead and one hand-carved amber bead. The oddest thing, as far as in my experience, was that we also found two little tiny pieces of Chinese porcelain, which I know, because I have a collection of porcelain, and I know that they were at least 18th century. It could have been earlier. And I thought, and they were from a tea bowl. Now, what the hell was a 18th century Chinese tea bowl doing in northern Greenland? I mean, it's just the most extraordinary thing. Anyway, of course, I didn't feel that I could take these things away with me as my souvenirs of this thing, because this is the patrimony, the patrimony of the Inuit, and so I simply painted studies of them in my tent, and then gave them to the school teacher, and said, "You must keep these. These are, and he said, well, these are from an earlier time," and you're certainly right about that. Yeah. So that was an extraordinary find, really.
Well, one thing we asked before about when you're working in the rainforest and different areas of the Grand Canyon. So here you are in Greenland in the cold. How did you alter your painting technique or daily routine to accommodate where you were?
Well, I suppose the big change really was, I mean, I'm used to high winds and drizzle, but the big change for me was this thing about the light, because it just never gets dark. And because I've trained myself really to always paint while it's light, I'll get up at dawn and go to bed at dusk usually, and work in between. Of course, I had no excuse to stop. And at first I was doing 16-hour days, and I would go to bed completely beaten, but still couldn't really sleep because it was just broad daylight outside. And of course, it would get to be 2 a.m. and I'd be painting, and the light would change, it would get even more beautiful, and this constantly changing, extraordinary razor sharp light, but fantastically subtle colors in it. But of course, the difficulty with that, apart from the fact that you can't keep up painting day after day, 16-hour days, I'd get to 8 o'clock at night and I think, I've kind of stopped, I must go to bed. And then I think, oh no, look, the light's just changed, it's even better now. And that way.
That's hard for a large piece too, because you can't paint the whole sky.
No, you can't repaint the whole darn thing. No, that's right. And so that proved exceptionally difficult. And also, of course, what happens is that the icebergs reflect the light, the sea reflects the icebergs and the light, and they all reflect each other. And so everything changes all the time. The subtle changes, just minute by minute, were just extraordinary to watch, and really frustrating because it would not stay still. Because everything, the icebergs are translucent and reflective. The water is translucent and reflective, and so they all reflect each other. And would change from pink to orange to yellow to grey to blue to turquoise, and it would just go on and on. It was a constant changing panoply.
What do you feel now when you see this artwork about 20 years after you painted it? Do you feel like it's a successful work, or what strikes you about it is?
I always thought it was successful in that it said exactly what I wanted to say about the icebergs, and I did feel that I had, it's as I've explained, because icebergs are so tricky to paint. Water is one of the trickiest things to paint anyway, and then stick an iceberg in it, and you've really got trouble. And so I felt that I had actually managed to resolve some good paintings, and everybody thought they were beautiful, but nobody wanted to buy them. It was quite interesting. And I mean, in some ways, it proves that I don't just paint what people want, because I never know what people want. I thought that everybody would be knocked backwards by these paintings, and I thought they were some of the most beautiful things I'd ever done. And I thought people would be knocked out by them, and so they were. But nobody wanted to buy them. And I can remember one of the paintings, I'm not sure which one, it may have been the one behind you, I can't remember which one it was now, was in an exhibition in New York on Fifth Avenue. And it was in the window of the gallery, and it was in June, which was ferociously hot. And every morning, during the day, people would press their noses to the window and look at this beautiful iceberg painting. And every morning the technician had to go out with a cloth and wipe all the nose prints off the window, because there's so many people pressing their noses to look at this iceberg painting. But there's still nobody bought it. I mean, it was just
that was a good sales strategy, though. Like, put it out on a hot day. Yeah.
But I talked to another painter whose name I can't remember now, who lived in Georgia, and he'd been working down in Antarctica with the American Antarctic Survey. He'd been artist in residence, and he'd done some wonderful paintings, oil paintings of icebergs. And I went to his studio and we looked through them all, and I really enjoyed them, and we chatted and had a good time together. And I said, so was your exhibition successful? He said, it's highly successful. He said it showed at the some gallery in Washington, and toured to some prestigious galleries, and I said, so was it successful financially? He said I didn't sell a single one. And when I asked my art dealer why nobody wanted to buy them, he said, well, people say, well, it's a beautiful thing and I absolutely love it, but I couldn't have it in my house, it's too cold. Make my house too cold, I'd have to turn the heating up.
Thank you for your time, Tony.
You're
And
very welcome.
thank you for sharing your unique talents as an artist and storyteller to celebrate our natural world.